The morning I found the second set of books hidden inside my husband's old briefcase, my coffee was still hot on the counter, and the birds were singing outside, like it was any ordinary Tuesday in Charlotte. Gerald Whitmore had spent 31 years telling me we were always just one bad month away from trouble. Meanwhile, inside that battered leather briefcase I'd never thought to open, sat 2 spiral notebooks filled with numbers that told an entirely different story. I didn't say a word. I didn't touch a single page more than I had to. I just stood there, in our kitchen in my housecoat and slippers, staring at the handwriting I recognized as my husband's, and understood for the first time that the man I married might be a stranger. Before I tell you how we got there, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever looked across the breakfast table, at someone you've known for decades and suddenly realized you were looking at a face you no longer recognized? If you have, leave me a comment below. I read every single one. And, if you're watching tonight, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Stories like this one deserve to be heard, and you deserve to know you're not alone. Gerald Whitmore was the kind of man other people trusted immediately. Firm handshake, steady eye contact, always knew the name of your waitress and remembered to ask about her kids the next time. In our neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina, he was the man neighbors called when their gutters needed checking or their teenage sons needed a talk. At our church, he served on the finance committee for nearly 15 years. People said Gerald had a gift for numbers and they meant it as a compliment. I believed them. I believed him. We met when I was 26 and he was 30. I was working as a medical records clerk at a hospital downtown and taking night classes toward a business degree I never quite finished. Gerald was in insurance, methodical and reliable, in the way that felt like safety when you're young, and still figuring out what you actually want from life. He asked me to dinner twice before I said yes. My mother said he seemed like a man who planned things carefully, and she meant that as the highest possible praise. We married the following spring. I wore my grandmother's pearls. For most of our early years together, things were genuinely good. We bought a small house. We had our son, Nathan, and 4 years later, our daughter, Claire. Gerald worked long hours but came home for dinner most nights. He coached Nathan's soccer team one season and built Claire a wooden playhouse in the backyard that she refused to give up even as a teenager. I went back to work part-time at a pediatric office when the kids started school, and for a while, life felt exactly like what we'd planned together. Then, somewhere around our 15th anniversary, things began shifting in ways I couldn't quite name at the time. Gerald started handling everything financially. Not aggressively, not with arguments, just quietly and completely. He consolidated our accounts. He said it made taxes simpler. He set up automatic payments for everything so I wouldn't have to worry, which sounded thoughtful until I realized I no longer had visibility into where anything actually went. If I asked about our savings, he answered quickly and confidently enough to make the question feel unnecessary. We're building steadily, Bev. Trust the process. Bev. Short for Beverly. That's me. I was 63 years old when I found those notebooks, and I can tell you that by that point I had spent the better part of 2 decades trusting a process I was never actually allowed to see. The smaller signs came slowly over the years, the way these things always do. Gerald discouraged me from returning to work full-time after Claire graduated high school. It doesn't make sense at this stage, he said. We'd just be paying more in taxes. I had mixed feelings about that, but Gerald made it sound so logical, and I had grown so accustomed to his logic feeling more reliable than my instincts that I let it go. I volunteered at the church instead. I became room mother for things that no longer needed room mothers. I made myself useful in all the quiet, invisible ways that women learn to do when their world slowly shrinks to the size of someone else's comfort. I stopped asking about money after a while, not because I didn't care, but because asking always made me feel foolish. Gerald never raised his voice about it. He simply had a way of answering that made my questions seem impractical. Bev, you don't need to worry about this. That's what I'm here for. Looking back now, I understand what that was. It wasn't protection. It was management. The crack appeared 18 months before I found those notebooks, and it came because of Claire. My daughter had been married to her husband, Derek Solis, for 6 years, when things fell apart between them. I won't go into the details of their marriage, because that's Claire's story to tell, not mine. What I will tell you is that she called me on a Thursday afternoon in February, sounding like someone had knocked the air clean out of her chest. Derek had emptied their joint savings account. He had already retained a lawyer. Claire had come home from work to find half the closets cleaned out and a note on the kitchen counter. I drove to her apartment within the hour. When Gerald came home that evening, and I explained what had happened, I watched his face for the reaction a father should have toward his child in crisis. What I saw instead was something closer to calculation. He listened. He nodded. He asked a few practical questions. Then he set his fork down carefully and said Claire needed to understand that sometimes marriages ran their course, and the most important thing now was for her not to make any emotional financial decisions. I stared at him. She needs a lawyer, Gerald. He sighed through his nose. Lawyers cost money, Bev. She's your daughter. He picked his fork back up. I know who she is. That night I lay awake listening to him sleep and thought about all the other times Gerald had responded to someone else's pain with arithmetic. The time Nathan's car broke down 2 states away, and Gerald spent 20 minutes calculating towing costs before asking if Nathan was safe. The time my sister lost her job, and Gerald suggested she had probably seen it coming and should have prepared better. I had always told myself Gerald was practical. Practical people kept families stable. Practical people didn't panic. That night I started wondering whether what I'd been calling practical was actually something colder than that. A few weeks after Claire's marriage collapsed, I drove over to her apartment with soup and groceries and found her sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, looking like someone trying to read a map in a language they'd never learned. Her attorney had asked her to document shared assets and debts going back several years. Claire was an elementary school art teacher. Paperwork had never been her strength. We sat together for 3 hours working through it. At some point, she looked at me and said, quietly, "Mom, do you actually know what you and Dad have saved?" I opened my mouth and then closed it again. I thought I did. She didn't push. She just nodded. The way people nod when they already suspected the answer. That nod stayed with me the whole drive home. The following week, Gerald left early on a Saturday morning for a golf outing with men from the church finance committee. He kissed my cheek, reminded me his dry cleaning needed picking up, and backed out of the driveway with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether his world was secure. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after his car disappeared. Then I walked to the hall closet, where Gerald kept his old briefcases, the ones he'd cycled through over the years, before settling on the leather messenger bag he carried now. There were 3 of them stacked on the upper shelf. I'm not entirely sure what I was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe I just needed to feel like I was allowed to look. The 3rd briefcase, an old brown leather one with a broken buckle he'd had since before we married, felt heavier than it should have. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it down. The zipper pulled stiffly. Inside, beneath a folded gas station map from 1980, 2 expired insurance cards were the notebooks. 2 of them, black spiral covers, both nearly full. I sat down slowly and opened the first one. The numbers took me a few minutes to understand. I'm not an accountant, but I had enough background from my business classes and my years at that pediatric office to follow a ledger when I was looking at one. What I was looking at was a ledger. Account numbers I didn't recognize, regular transfers going back at least 8 years, investment figures that didn't match anything Gerald had ever mentioned when he occasionally, briefly, summarized our finances for me. I flipped to the second notebook, more of the same but also something else. A name appearing several times, always beside account numbers. Annette Pruitt. I didn't know anyone named Annette Pruitt. I closed both notebooks, put them back exactly as I'd found them, rezipped the briefcase, and returned it to the closet shelf. Then I went and sat in the living room with my hands folded in my lap and stared at the wall for a very long time. When Gerald came home that afternoon, smelling like fresh air and sunscreen, he found me reading on the back porch. I smiled when he appeared in the doorway. He asked if I'd picked up his dry cleaning. I had. He thanked me. We had leftover chicken for dinner. He watched the news and fell asleep in his recliner by 9. I didn't sleep at all. Over the next 2 weeks I moved carefully, The way you move when you've discovered something dangerous and you aren't yet sure how to handle it. I paid closer attention to things I'd trained myself to overlook. Gerald's phone always kept face down on tables. His habit of taking calls in the garage. The mail, which he consistently retrieved before I could see it. Small things. Things I'd assigned innocent explanations to for years. One evening while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit briefly. A name. A. Pruitt. I stared until it went dark again. That weekend, while Gerald attended a deacon's meeting at church, I sat at my laptop and typed the name into a search engine. Annette Pruitt, Charlotte, NC. She wasn't hard to find. LinkedIn profile, fairly sparse. A financial administrator, recently retired, living in the Ballantine area. Her profile photo showed a woman around my age, maybe a few years younger. Gray hair kept short, practical glasses, the kind of face that belonged to someone who dealt with spreadsheets and didn't make a fuss about it. She didn't look like a woman having an affair with my husband. She looked like someone who filed things correctly and kept her desk organized. Something about that made the discomfort in my chest sharpen rather than ease, because if this wasn't about romance, I needed to think carefully about what it actually was. I searched deeper. Annette Pruitt had worked for a property management consulting firm for over 20 years. The firm had connections to several smaller real estate holding companies. Say, one of those holding company names, Whitmore Property Group LLC, stopped my heart for a full 3 seconds. Whitmore. Gerald's last name. My last name. A company I had never once heard mentioned in 31 years of marriage. I sat with that information for a long time before I was able to stand up and walk away from the computer. The anger that moved through me was quiet, which surprised me. I expected something louder. Instead, what I felt was a cold, clarifying kind of fury. The type that doesn't cloud your thinking but sharpens it. The way very cold air makes everything suddenly precise. Gerald had a company. Gerald had accounts I'd never seen. Gerald had a woman named Annette Pruitt tied to financial structures he'd kept entirely separate from our shared life. And Gerald had done all of this while telling me, for decades, that we needed to be careful, that we couldn't afford things, that I shouldn't worry about the finances, because he was handling everything. I thought about every time Claire had mentioned needing help, and Gerald had sighed. Every time Nathan had called, with a money question, and Gerald had given a careful, discouraging answer. Every clearance rack I'd bought from, because new clothes felt like an indulgence I shouldn't ask for. Every vacation we'd postponed. Every small want I'd set aside because my husband told me the margins were too tight. I thought about the dry cleaning I'd picked up without being asked, every week for 31 years. The following Tuesday, while Gerald was at his monthly finance committee luncheon, I drove downtown to the office of an attorney named Patricia Holloway. Family law, asset litigation, 22 years of experience. Her receptionist had a kind voice on the phone and didn't ask me too many questions about why I was calling. Patricia Holloway turned out to be exactly the person I needed in that moment. She was around my age, direct without being unkind, the sort of woman who listened carefully and took notes by hand. When I spread the photocopies I'd made across her desk, including the notebook pages I'd carefully reproduced while Gerald was at church one Sunday, she read in silence for a long time. Finally, she looked up. "How long has your husband managed your finances exclusively?" "Most of our marriage," I said. 30 years, maybe more." "And you had no knowledge of this LLC or these accounts?" "None." She nodded slowly. "Beverly, what you're describing has a name. It's called financial concealment within a marriage, and the documentation you've brought suggests this has been structured deliberately over a significant period of time." I folded my hands in my lap. "How significant?" She tapped one page. "These transfers go back at least 10 years that I can see here, possibly longer." I looked down at my hands. Gerald had been building a separate financial life for at least a decade, maybe longer, while I scheduled his dentist appointments and picked up his dry cleaning, and told myself that trust was the foundation of a good marriage. Patricia continued carefully. "The connection to this Annette Pruitt is important. Her role in the administrative structure suggests she may have knowingly participated, but it may also be more complicated than it appears." "You think he used her the way he used me?" She paused. "I think it's worth finding out before you draw conclusions." I sat in her office for almost 2 hours. By the time I left, I had a plan, a private email account Gerald didn't know about, and a list of documents I needed to quietly gather. Patricia's last instruction before I walked out the door was the one that steadied me. Document everything before you say anything. I had spent 31 years speaking before I had the full picture. I was not going to make that mistake again. The hardest part of the following weeks was sitting across from Gerald at dinner every night and maintaining the surface of our life without cracking. Gerald talked about church projects and Nathan's promotion at work and a neighbor's new fence while I passed him the breadbasket and asked appropriate questions and thought about offshore holding accounts. It was during this period that Claire called me from a grocery store parking lot, crying so hard I had to ask her twice to slow down. Her landlord had increased her rent with 60 days' notice. Combined with the legal bills from the divorce, she was looking at a shortfall she couldn't cover. "I'm not asking Dad," she said before I could even respond. "I know what he'll say." She did know. That was the worst part. I told her I would figure something out. I didn't tell her yet what I had already found. That afternoon I drove to an ATM and withdrew money from the small, personal account I'd opened quietly, per Patricia's instructions. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to help Claire with first and last month's rent while her situation stabilized. I slid the envelope across her kitchen table and watched her cry in that way. Adults cry when they're too exhausted to be proud anymore, and I held her hand and thought about all the years her father had made her feel like needing help was a character flaw. Something hardened in me that afternoon that never quite softened again. The week before I was ready to move forward with Patricia, I made the decision to find Annette Pruitt. I'm still not entirely sure what I expected. Some version of the confrontation you imagine, the other woman, the explanation that would make everything worse, or clarify everything at once. I drove to the Ballantyne neighborhood on a gray Wednesday morning and sat outside the address I'd found in the property records for nearly 20 minutes before I walked to the door. She answered on the second knock. Annette Pruitt in person was smaller than I'd expected, with careful eyes that went very still the moment I said my name. "Beverly Whitmore," I said. She gripped the doorframe. "I know who you are." "Can I come in?" She stepped back. Her house was tidy in the way that spoke of someone living carefully within a budget. Nothing extravagant, nothing that suggested she had benefited financially from whatever arrangement existed between her and my husband. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was how frightened she looked. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I told her, which was partly true. She sat across from me in a small armchair and twisted her fingers together. "I've been dreading this for years," she said. What she told me over the following 40 minutes rearranged everything I thought I understood. Annette Pruitt had not been Gerald's romantic partner. She had been his administrative cover. After he'd quietly established Whitmore Property Group, he'd needed someone with professional credentials to handle the legitimate paperwork, someone whose name could appear on filings without raising some questions. Annette had been a colleague from his early years in insurance. When her husband left her with significant debt, 12 years ago, Gerald had offered her a solution: help him manage the administrative side of a small holding company, sign what needed signing, and receive a small monthly payment in return. He told her it was a tax strategy, perfectly legal, entirely routine. It was not perfectly legal. She had come to understand that several years in, by which point she felt too implicated to walk away. "I told him I wanted out 3 times, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. He always found a reason why leaving would look worse for me than staying. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. 10 years of quiet desperation visible in the lines around her eyes, and I thought about how Gerald had a gift for making people feel that leaving would be more dangerous than staying. He had practiced that skill on me for 31 years. I drove home from Ballantyne feeling hollowed out in the particular way that comes not from learning something new, but from understanding something you already knew in a different language. Gerald's car was in the driveway when I got back. He was in the kitchen making coffee, as ordinary as a Tuesday. "How was your afternoon?" he asked. "Fine," I said, long. He handed me a mug without looking up from the counter. "You've seemed distracted lately." I wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic. "Maybe I've just been thinking." He glanced toward me then, something brief and assessing moving behind his eyes. "You're not worried about something, are you, Claire?" "No more than usual." He nodded and went back to the coffee. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone with the folder. Patricia had helped me organize 4 weeks of quiet, careful documentation. Account records, LLC filings, transfer histories, Annette Pruitt's contact information, and the summary she'd agreed to provide to my attorney. I added one more item to the folder, a note, handwritten, 3 sentences long. Then I went to bed and slept better than I had in months. 2 days later, Gerald left for what he described as a Saturday morning meeting at the church, something about reviewing the annual budget. He kissed my cheek. He told me not to wait on lunch. The moment his car turned out of the driveway, I moved with a steadiness that surprised even me. I went to his home office, unlocked the filing cabinet with the spare key I'd located 3 weeks earlier, and placed my folder on top of his personal files where it could not be missed. On the very top sat the note I'd written. "I know about Whitmore Property Group. I know about the accounts. I've already spoken with an attorney, and I've already spoken with Annette." Then I went and sat in the living room and waited. I'd called Nathan the night before. Not with the full story, just enough. "Mom needs you close this weekend. I think things are going to be hard." Nathan had arrived early that morning and was sitting in his truck at the end of our street, waiting for my text. Gerald came home at 12:30, looking the way he always looked after church meetings, slightly satisfied, slightly important. He set his keys on the counter. Called my name down the hallway. I answered from the living room. He appeared in the door for a moment. He was simply my husband of 31 years, tie slightly loosened, the gray at his temples I'd watched arrive over the years. "I need to check something in the office," he said. "I know," I said. He went. I sat still. The grandfather clock in the hallway counted the seconds. Then I heard his footsteps stop. A long silence. The sound of papers shifting then. "Beverly." Just my name. But the way he said it was entirely different from any way he'd said it before. Not a greeting, not an irritation. Something rawer than either. I walked to the office doorway. He was standing at the open filing cabinet, holding my folder, my note on top. His face had gone a color I'd never seen on it before. "What is this?" His voice was controlled, but only barely. "I think you know what it is." He looked up from the papers. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Gerald set the folder down on his desk very slowly, which told me more than shouting would have. He was still trying to manage the situation, still looking for a way to organize this into something he could control. "We should talk about this calmly," he said. "I agree, Bev." His voice shifted into something softer, more familiar. "You have to understand. Everything I did was to protect our future." I looked at him steadily. "Whose future?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "Because from where I'm standing, Gerald," I said quietly, "this looks like a future you were building for yourself. That's not fair. You let Claire believe she couldn't come to us for help." I kept my voice even. "You watched our daughter work 2 jobs and apologize for needing her parents while you moved money through a company she never knew existed." His jaw tightened. "It's more complicated than that." "I know it is. Patricia Holloway knows it is too." The name hit him visibly. He looked toward the window, away from me. The first time in 31 years I'd watched Gerald Whitmore look for somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't my face. "You spoke with a lawyer, weeks ago." He turned back. His expression had moved through several things and settled on something I recognized finally as fear. A quiet, calculating fear. At that exact moment I heard the front door. Nathan's footsteps in the entryway, deliberately ordinary, the sound of a son who'd shown up because his mother asked him to. He appeared in the office doorway behind me and took in the scene in one careful look. "Mom." Then, "Dad." Gerald straightened. "Son, your mother has found some old paperwork and drawn some conclusions." Nathan looked at me. I reached behind me and passed him the folder. He read slowly. I watched Gerald watch him read. For the first time I could remember, Gerald did not speak while someone else processed information. He stood very still. Nathan closed the folder. "Dad." His voice was quiet. "This is a real estate LLC. It's a business structure, with accounts we didn't know about. For strategic tax purposes," Gerald started. Nathan looked at him for a long moment in a way I'd never seen my son look at his father. Like he was recalibrating something. "How much is in these accounts?" Gerald didn't answer. How much, Dad? The number Gerald finally said was large enough that Nathan had to repeat it to make sure he'd heard correctly. The room was very quiet after that. Gerald tried, in the following minutes, to explain. Tax sheltering, long-term planning, legal complexity that laypersons tended to misread. He was calm about it. He was reasonable. He used the same measured tone he'd used my entire marriage, to make me feel that my concerns were uninformed emotions rather than valid observations. But Nathan had my folder, and Nathan was not me at 26, meeting a man who made stability feel like love. This is why Claire couldn't come to you, Nathan said finally. It wasn't that we didn't have money. Gerald rubbed one hand over his face. You told her she needed to learn from her choices. Nathan's voice didn't rise. That was almost harder to watch than anger would have been. She was sleeping on a friend's couch, Dad. The mediation took 6 weeks. I won't say it was clean because it wasn't. Gerald hired a competent attorney who used the word mischaracterization more times than I could count. Patricia used the phrase intentional concealment of marital assets and showed documentation to support it every single time. Annette provided a written statement through her own attorney. That, I think, was the moment Gerald understood how completely the architecture of what he'd built had come apart. He didn't fight the settlement in the end. Whether that was remorse or calculation, I honestly don't know anymore, and I've made my peace with not knowing. What I do know is that I was 63 years old when I signed the final paperwork, sitting in Patricia Holloway's office on a bright March morning, with traffic moving slowly outside the window and coffee going cold on the table beside me. I held the pen for a moment and thought about my grandmother's pearls, about the girl who'd worn them, about all the years between that morning and this one, and everything that had been real in them, and everything that hadn't. Then I signed. The apartment I moved into is small by any standard Gerald would have applied to our life together. 1 bedroom, a galley kitchen, a balcony with just enough room for 2 chairs, and a pot of herbs I keep meaning to tend more consistently. It's in a neighborhood with a farmer's market on Saturday mornings, and a coffee shop I've started going to alone, which still feels faintly transgressive in a way that makes me smile. Claire helped me move in on us a Sunday in April. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor of the empty living room, while Lena, her daughter, ran from room to room testing the echo. At some point, Claire looked at me over her pizza box and said, quietly, "You seem lighter, Mom." I thought about that word for a long time afterward. She was right. I felt lighter. Not happy in an uncomplicated way, because grief doesn't work that cleanly. I still had mornings where I sat with my coffee and felt the strange ache of 3 decades that were real and lost at once. But there was something underneath that ache now, something steadier than I'd felt in years. The particular steadiness that comes from no longer managing someone else's moods, no longer shrinking yourself to fit inside another person's version of your life. Nathan came by the following weekend with a bookshelf he'd assembled himself. Slightly lopsided, which he was embarrassed about, and which I loved for exactly that reason. We had dinner together, just the 2 of us, and at some point he said, "I keep thinking about how you handled all of it. How quiet you were through the whole thing." I had to think about how to answer that. I was quiet, I finally said, because I finally understood that speaking too soon would have cost me everything. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're rearranging something in their thinking. Before he left, he stood in my doorway for a moment. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I touched his arm. "The most important thing you can do now is see it clearly going forward. Gerald has called a handful of times. The conversations are brief and follow a familiar shape, half regret, half justification, the arithmetic of a man still trying to balance an equation that no longer involves me. The last time he called, he said he hoped I knew that, despite everything, he had always cared about my security." I stood at my balcony window watching the street below. Then I said, gently, and finally, "Gerald, you cared about your own security." And then I said goodbye. I signed up for a financial literacy class at the community center the following month. I was by far the oldest person in the room. The instructor was approximately 30 years old and very earnest, and I sat in the back taking careful notes about compound interest and portfolio diversification, and all the vocabulary of the world I'd been excluded from for 3 decades. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that plastic chair. Capable. Deeply. quietly, irreversibly capable. Lena came to stay with me for a weekend in the fall, just her and me. And we planted bulbs in the small garden bed outside my building together. She's 6 and very serious about dirt. At one point she patted the soil over a tulip bulb, looked up at me with her grandmother's eyes, and said, "Will we get to see them come up?" "Yes," I told her. "We just have to wait through the winter." She considered that seriously. Then she said, "That's okay. Waiting is okay if something good comes after." I looked at my granddaughter and thought, not for the first time, that children carry more wisdom than we remembered to give them credit for. It's a strange thing to rebuild a life at 63. People assume, I think, that the rebuilding is the hard part. What no one tells you is that the hardest part is actually the unlearning. Unlearning the habit of asking permission. Unlearning the instinct to make yourself smaller before someone else can ask you to. Unlearning the difference between love and management, between security and control. Gerald didn't steal years from me with cruelty. He stole them with reasonableness. With calm voices and logical explanations, and the daily quiet message that my role was to trust and his role was to decide. And I accepted that arrangement long past the point where I should have asked different questions, because I had been taught, slowly and thoroughly, that his judgment was more reliable than my own. It wasn't. If you're watching this, and you recognize something in this story, please hear me when I say this. The moment you begin doubting your own instincts, because someone else has spent years suggesting you should, that is the moment to pay attention. Not to them, to yourself. I spent 31 years being the woman who didn't need to worry about the finances because someone else was handling everything. I am 64 years old now, and I handle my own finances. Every single account, every statement, every decision, good and imperfect, and entirely my own. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this story reached you in some way tonight, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild something you thought was permanent? Have you found yourself later in life finally living in a way that actually belongs to you? Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story, please share it with her. You are never too far into a life to start telling the truth about it.